When you need to pick a server for hosting, you're often going to be presented by a table like this, where you have a bunch of options for the RAM and processor and storage, bandwidth, but it may be unclear exactly what this all means and how they affect the quality of your hosting. So in this video, I quickly want to go over the options that you're going to be presented with when you pick a server for hosting your website and how you know which one to pick. So this table is actually part of Cloudways. Cloudways is a so-called managed web host. We'll talk about what that means as well. I had a great time working with Cloudways so far. They are today's sponsor, but everything that you're going to learn in this video is going to be generally applicable. I'll talk about WordPress hosting, but also you need to know a little bit about hosting in general. So first of all, what is hosting? What is a server? What is all of that? Well, a server is actually just a box of electronics. And usually these days it's in a so-called data center. So you can imagine here we have a bunch of servers. One of these rectangular shapes is essentially just a server, just a bunch of electronics in there with various components. We don't need to know about that. So if you want to make a website available to other people, we want to store our website on there, and then other people can connect to there to get the website, right? Whether you're using WordPress or just any other way to create websites, that's essentially what happens. Now, what is a website actually? When I say website, actually it's just some text, an HTML file. It's just some text. And typically for styling, there is another file called CSS. And sometimes you also have some script. Those are usually JavaScript files. And your website may also have images, right? Or videos, maybe a font, right? So these are all the assets, you could say, that make up a website, right? So this entire collection here, I would say, constitutes a website. And just to show you that with my own website, actually, so I have my website here and I opened up, right click, inspect, and there is a network tab here just to show you what I mean with this. You don't need to know about this, but if I refresh here, you can see there's a bunch of things that are being loaded. So when I go to bytegrad.com, which is my website, you can see there's a bunch of files loaded actually. It starts with HTML, right? So here is actually the initial request to bytegrad.com. And what do we get as a response when you go there? We're getting a file here with HTML, right? This is an HTML file, just a bunch of text essentially. And in this file, in turn, we may link to other assets like a style sheet file. You can see there is some style sheet that we're trying to get. Here, we're also trying to get a font, and maybe there are images on the page. So there's a bunch of other things here. You can see there's a style sheet, there's a script, JavaScript, there's an image here for the logo. So there's a bunch of other things that are being loaded. So you have some website, whether it's a WordPress website or some other website, you need to put it on a server so that other people can access it. So how does that work in practice? Because these data centers can be anywhere in the world. There's many data centers, so you can choose to put your website in many different locations. Let's say I put it in Australia, right? So here there's data centers all over the world, including in Australia. So I could put the website somewhere in there. So when somebody from New York, let's say, connects to my website, there will be a network request all the way there. And there are actually cables in the ocean. So there's like some electrical signal goes through these cables. And actually, I think it goes close to the coast with Brazil. And then at some point it goes like this to Australia. So it will reach that server of ours, and that server of ours will send back some other electrical signals over the cable, and those should represent some HTML. So it will go all the way back to that person in New York, right? So there's always a request and a response. That's essentially how the whole internet works. There's always a request response cycle. And that is essentially what happens when you type in a URL, right? So here I typed in my website name. If I press enter here, what I just described is there will be some network request from my location all the way to some other location in the world where this domain name is pointing to, right? So this server will have an address. And so I have set it up so that when you type in that nice name in the URL, it will go to that address and then it will go back again. That's about configuring DNS, as it's called. So basically, if you've purchased a domain name, I have purchased bytegrad.com as a nice, easy to understand URL. With your domain provider, usually they have a dashboard, and then you can tell them when somebody types this in, what is the location of that server? These servers typically have a special location, like some IP address essentially. And that's how the internet knows where to route that request to. So then when you type in that name, it goes to that location. And also very quickly, we have also HTTPS in the URL, which just means that the information associated with this request has an additional layer of security because it's going to be encrypted. And all of these things, by the way, I can do on a host like Cloudways. Cloudways allows me to configure SSL right? That's SSL, where you have HTTPS and you get a nice lock icon sometimes in the browser, depends on which browser you're using. I can do all of that here in Cloudways. I'll show you the dashboard in a second. Okay, so you can say this is a long distance, right? So this takes a lot of time, and that's right. So if I put my website in Australia, it's going to take a long time for people from the US to, it's going to feel slow for them because it's going to take a long time to get a response. So what happens is you can use a CDN. So this is very common. You can copy your website on other servers, right? So I can make a copy of that and put it maybe on a server in the United States. So then when somebody from New York goes to my website, they will actually connect to that copy in the US, right? So remember, there are so many data centers. So for sure, there's going to be, some data center with a server close to wherever the user is connecting from. And maybe I have another user in Germany, let's say, right? I can also make sure that my website is on a server in Germany. Somebody from Germany has super fast access as well, and they don't have to go all the way to Australia. But those are just copies, right? So you still need like an origin server, right? Where it all starts and where it's like the source of truth. And I can do that in Cloudways very easily as well. They are using another service under the hood called Cloudflare. Maybe you've heard of that one, to make that easily possible. Okay, so those are some things I think that are good to know when it comes to servers. So if you're gonna pick some kind of hosting, whether it's WordPress or some other framework, that is essentially what you're picking, right? You're picking a box of electronics, and it's used in a way that I just described. All right, so now we know why we want a server, right? So now we want a server. So now we can go, there are a lot of options, and don't get overwhelmed, because honestly, it's not really about the exact numbers here. It's about the spectrum, right? So here at the lowest end of the spectrum, you're gonna have some options that are gonna be mostly suitable if you have a simple setup, maybe one website, low to moderate traffic, right? Not that many visitors, nothing really crazy. Here in the middle of the spectrum, so if you get a little bit more powerful here, now you're going to pick a server is a little bit more powerful, right? So we have a little bit more available here. We'll talk about what each individual thing means here, but this could be more interesting if you're maybe a freelancer, small agency, and instead of hosting one site, maybe you have multiple sites, maybe multiple WordPress sites or just websites in general. Or maybe you have one website, but it's very popular. You have a lot of traffic and maybe a lot of images or media, or maybe like an e-commerce website that is picking up some traffic. With an e-commerce website, you have usually a large product catalog, you have a cart, you're working with a lot of data in a database typically. So you need a little bit more juice. At the end of the spectrum here, usually you're going to find like agencies, like full-blown agencies that have dozens or maybe even 100 or 200 sites that they're managing for their client. Or you have maybe one very, very popular website, like a very large popular website that has a ton of traffic, and you need the maximum essentially. And you also want to think a little bit about potential spikes in resources. So if you have that e-commerce website, for example, you're going to have a big spike on Black Friday, right? So it could be possible that in 1 or 2 days in the year, your traffic is like 10 times as much as regular. Or if you're some kind of ticket website and you're selling tickets on your website, if there's a popular concert that you're offering tickets for, you may have like a week or 2 weeks where you have a lot of traffic, way more than usual. And also, for example, sending an email. So if you send an email to your list and you have, a couple thousand people suddenly receiving an email or clicking on it, and you have a sudden surge in traffic, that's something to pay attention to as well. And actually, that's also why I like Cloudways, because they have this Cloudways autonomous feature, which helps you with auto scaling upward. Basically, they will automatically assign more resources when your website needs it. So let's quickly go over what these things mean. And if you're using WordPress, for example, what are some things to pay attention to, like plugins and themes and backups? Like how does all of that affect that? And what are these other options that we have here? Let's start here with these other logos. Why do we see other companies' logos here? Well, that's because when you are looking for a server, are you looking for a complete dedicated server? Probably not, right? This is what you would do back in the day. You would literally buy a server, it would get shipped to your home. That would be like a real physical hardware device, and you would connect it to the internet, and that's how you would work, right? You would have servers like literally around you. These days, we are just renting something in a data center, right? In the cloud, as people call it. So we could rent a dedicated server, right? The whole server literally for ourselves, literally this box of electronics just for ourselves. But that's quite expensive because we are taking it all for ourselves. So in practice, it's more common you only rent part of it essentially. You just take a share of that. So that share, just the share itself, you could rent it as a VPS, a virtual private server. So it's not actually, it's not all dedicated to yourself in terms of hardware, but the company that rents it to you, they are splitting the resources of that server up, and they're renting part of that to you, a piece of that. I can rent a VPS on DigitalOcean or these other companies. The downside of a VPS is that it's a lot of work, right? I have to set a lot of things up myself. You need to be tech savvy because you're gonna type like terminal commands and things like that. You need to set up Linux, like an operating system. It may be cheaper, but it comes with a lot of setup hassle and also maintenance, right? Keeping it secure and things like that. Now, that's what these companies offer you. So I could go directly to them and do it like that. I don't want to set everything up myself. I want a solution that manages as much as possible for me, so I can just focus on growing my website. So that's where a managed host comes into play. And so a managed host, well, they do all of that for us, setting up the operating system, setting up WordPress, for example. I'll show you that in a second, how to set it up here and what happens. And we just pick how much compute, essentially, we want to assign to our share. And they take care of the rest. And that's what Cloudways does for me, right? So if I'm going with Cloudways here, I can still pick where my website, which company's server will actually, so I can pick these other options if I want. Let's just go with DigitalOcean here. Cloudways is actually a DigitalOcean company. Maybe you're already familiar with some of these other hosts and you want to stick to using their servers, and that's what you can do with Cloudways. So I'm just going to stick to DigitalOcean here. So the actual server will come from DigitalOcean. Cloudways will make sure that if I install WordPress that I get a bunch of benefits, which we will also talk about in a second. All right, so then here I have these options. So how much compute essentially do I want to assign to my website? So here they have a plan, and this is mostly dependent on what these other companies, how they call it, right? So on DigitalOcean, I can have the DO2GB. So that means 2 gigabytes of RAM. So what is RAM actually? So this is one of the items that are going to be in that box, right? So there's going to be a bunch of items in there, RAM piece, a so-called CPU processor, and there's going to be some hard disk or hard drive or basically storage. That's what you see here. How do I know how much RAM I need? Well, RAM and also processor, by the way, these are kind of similar in the impact they have, which is these are mostly for actual performance. So essentially, the more you have of this, the faster it's going to feel for the user. And if you're using WordPress, for example, if you use a lot of plugins or certain themes, you may need more of this. Some of the plugins, they take up a lot of RAM, for example. If you use some kind of page builder or an e-commerce plugin or backup or security plugin, some of them take up a lot of RAM. Also, if you have a lot of images or videos, right? Videos especially, they have to stream to the user. It also takes up quite a bit of RAM. And if you have multiple sites, of course, you're gonna need more. If you're managing multiple sites for your clients and they're separate clients, the one thing you want to pay attention to is that one of those websites does not affect the other ones. If you have one website that blows up in popularity and you're on this cheaper plan, let's say, well, since that one website is servicing a lot of requests, it may already take up a lot of processor and RAM power. And so if there's a request for those other sites, it may take longer and those users may feel like it's slow. So at a very minimum, people do tend to recommend at least, but pretty quickly you're already going to need 2 gigabytes of RAM, especially, with WordPress and you have some plugins, you have a nice theme. Maybe you're using some kind of page builder, going to be an e-commerce website with a cart. You're going to need very quickly this level already. It's also, a CPU is also just one of those items in the box. It's like the piece that coordinates everything. So if a user wants to see a product page, well, this CPU will make sure it gets the product data from the database, it renders an HTML page out of that and then sends it to the user. This one sort of coordinates everything. So here you will often get an option for cores. Basically, if you have 2 cores, you can do more tasks in parallel. You can sort of think about it like if you have 2 requests coming in from 2 different users, it can do 2 things at the same time. But big caveat there is a lot of those things have already been worked on over the years. So even on one core, it has found other ways to make something similar happen. So you have to also take all of this a bit with a grain of salt, right? So a lot of the problems that maybe traditionally were problems, a lot of that has been worked around, especially in popular frameworks like WordPress. So it's not like the exact numbers here are super important, but of course, yeah, the more CPU you can get, the better. Now, sometimes you're also gonna hear vCPU. So with the small v, instead of CPU, it will say v virtual CPU, which is similar, but it's just more like simulated, right? So it could have 1 core, but they may simulate like 2 cores as an example. Not really something that we have to really worry about. So if your website has a lot of images or videos, and also if you're using WordPress, the code itself for the WordPress dashboard, and to make all that work, it needs to be stored somewhere, right? So there's going to be some piece in that box that stores everything. Basically, the other pieces then work with it, but you first need to store it somewhere so you can access it and do things on it, right? So here with storage, especially if you have a lot of media files, like if you're a photographer and you have a portfolio website with a lot of large, like high quality photos, you know, one big photo can be multiple megabytes. So if you have many of those photos, you're going to rack up a lot of storage, right? Or e-commerce website, you probably have a couple images for each product, right? So if you have a couple hundred products, very quickly, you're going to need a bunch of storage. But the HTML itself is not going to be, you know, HTML is super fast. It's just a bunch of text, right? That's very efficient. But especially media, images, videos, or again, if you have a bunch of plugins or themes, some of them can also take up a lot of storage. Or if you have a lot of backups, for example, if you do a WordPress backup, often these backups are stored on the same server actually. So that may also impact your storage. Also a good idea to just delete some of your old plugins or themes when you stop using them. Bandwidth is basically how much data you're transferring. So if your page, some user goes to your homepage and your homepage has one big, nice photo on there, that photo it could be a JPEG file, for example, could be 1 megabyte. So there's going to be 1 megabyte transferred, right, over the internet, you could say, through those cables, right? That's essentially bandwidth, right? So basically how much data your website is actually taking. So you can see that's actually it's going to be the same story. In practice, people do tend to run into issues with bandwidth, I would say more often, because they have large media files or they have a spike in traffic and suddenly they're taking up way more data than the plan they're on. With these other ones, I don't think people often have issues. Usually it's maybe a plugin that's causing an issue with these things. It's just going to be a little bit slower. With bandwidth, it may be substantially slower or just the request will not even work. Sometimes with RAM or processor, if this is completely full, it may not even work either and you'll get a 400, like a 500 status, like internal server error. But you can see all of these kind of work in conjunction, right? So if you have some reason for more bandwidth, probably you also need more of this and vice versa. So don't get hung up on the exact numbers here. It's about that spectrum. All right, so let's say for me here, I just have a simple website. I'm just going to go with DigitalOcean here. Here, I'm going to go with the cheapest plan. Let's actually see what happens if I sign up on a host like this. What else are we going to learn about and see? All right, so here I get into a nice dashboard in Cloudways here. I have some options here. So I can add a server. I can add a so-called app. Basically, WordPress, for example, is an app. And they have two options for that. They have a flexible app or the autonomous app. So autonomous helps with scaling up. Flexible is more standard, but they also have this autonomous feature, which is more powerful. And if you have like a mission critical website, Cloudways recommends that you pick that option. But you need to put the app on a server first, right? So first we need the actual server. So we're going to add a server and then we can add, what do we want to add on that server? So here I want to add an app. Let's say I'm building a WordPress website. So I can pick some options here. So by default, Cloudways adds a bunch of optimizations out of the box. That's one of the benefits of using a managed host. But if you want, they also have a cleaner version, right? So no Cloudways optimization. I can also pick WooCommerce here, by the way, PHP, Laravel, Magento. They're all based on PHP. Let's say I just want a standard WordPress installation here. I can give it a name, my first app, which is first, and I will just call that first server and first project. Okay, all right, so then we didn't pay yet, right? So I clicked there and we just got to the dashboard. Now we actually have to pay. We saw in the table that we just needed the cheapest option, right? Just as an example. At the minimum, it is typically recommended to go with 2 gigabytes, right? So with 1 gigabyte, it is a bit, living on the edge. So let me actually just pick 2 gigabytes. What is 2 gigabytes here? That's just the RAM that they refer to and with the respective other features that come with that. All right, so here we have the location. So this is the origin location, right? So if you remember from what we drew here, you probably want to put this in the location where most of your users are. So if most of your users are in the US, and then in the US, US is pretty big. So then there's usually a distinction between the western part of the US and the eastern. So let's say I want eastern US, New York, for example. Yes. Then I click on launch now, and it's going to actually make sure that I have some piece of that server in New York, right? I don't have to worry about setting up Linux or anything else that you would typically have to do with setting up a server or VPS yourself. Cloudways does all of that for me automatically. Ultimately, what I'm buying here is some compute, right? So some RAM, some storage. That is ultimately what I'm buying here. And traditionally, you had to do a lot of other setup yourself, but with a managed host, that is all abstracted away from you. All right, after a couple minutes, it is ready. So let me click on this and see what we get. All right, so here we have this IP to access that server, right? So remember that server will have some kind of address and we use an IP address for that. This is not a pretty address, right? So I don't want to type in this address in the URL bar, but typically you want to reserve like a nice name, right? So I use ByteGrad.com. I can set it up in my DNS provider, as it's called. So then we'll point to that particular domain, to that IP address. All right. So if I want, I can still use terminal commands and configure things that way, but I'm not going to do that. I get some nice monitoring out of the box. I have some other services here that I can add. So for example, they use Immunify 360 for security. Here I have some settings that I can apply here. So, there may be some malicious users perhaps, and they may try to upload huge files to your server. So here I can set the maximum that a request can upload, for example, or how much a single request can take up in terms of memory. All right, here for maintenance, for example, you need to install updates for your operating system. So the operating system here is already installed for me. Linux will have updates sometimes. We could technically do it manually, but again, with a managed host, it's just as easy as just setting some settings here in the dashboard. So so we want to have an hour in the night where the performance is a bit less so we can make the update. All right, so here for security, this is a big one actually, because if you're going to do it yourself without a managed host, it's a lot of work, right? Very error prone. All right, so here we can also change the size, right? So if we want to have those 4 gigabytes, we can do it very easily here. We can just change the size as much as we want and just scale manually like this. All right, so this is the actual server configuration. Now, where is my WordPress instance, for example, right? So I want to use WordPress. This is all the server. So if we go here, we have a server, we have an application automatically as well that was put on that server. So I'm going to go to my application here. It's a WordPress application, and they have a URL for me ready to go. It's a Cloudways URL. And here is my WordPress website. This is like a standard template. And if I want to log into the admin panel, that is this URL, just as you're familiar with when it comes to WordPress. Now, what's the username and password? Here we get the credentials to log in to the admin panel. So I'm just going to copy the password. All right, so then I'm logged in to my WordPress instance here. Here is the familiar WordPress dashboard. You can configure all the posts, everything with WordPress, but WordPress itself is like an app, right, that you put on a server, right? So this needs to run somewhere, and that's what we learned about in this video. We chose a server that we can run this on, including the actual website that the user will see, right? This will all run from the same server in this case. All right, now there's a bunch of optimizations that Cloudways adds here for us because it's a managed host, and it adds a lot of optimizations for WordPress. So staging is powerful because if you have some change, let's say a new plugin or a new theme, and you want to test it essentially before you push it live to production, before you push it to everyone, let's just try it first. So that's what we can do with a staging environment. So that's out of the box here, very easy. We get a bunch of monitoring here. We can see how much traffic we're getting and also how much bandwidth we're consuming, right? So how much data is being transferred over the internet. All right, so here we have some security options. All right, so here we have domain management. So here, this is the URL that we currently have. Now we can configure things so that we're gonna have a nicer URL like what I have, bytegrad.com. Cron job. So if you're not familiar with this, sometimes we just want to do something in the background essentially, right? Maybe you have an e-commerce website and somebody didn't finish the checkout, right? So then maybe 1 hour after that abandoned cart, we want to send them an email, right? Just that's something we're going to do as a task in the background. Here we can set the SSL, right? Nice HTTPS with the green lock that we like to see. Backup. So of course we want to back up our WordPress website. All right, so here they also have some settings for Cloudflare. So here's where you can set up the CDN, for example. Also optimize images, very important, and really make it as fast as possible for your users. But you can see we get a bunch of things here out of the box, and they also have like more advanced options. So with the autonomous feature, they recommend it if you really need maximum performance. It's for what they call mission critical website built on something called Kubernetes, but that's already pretty advanced. We don't have to worry about that. That's what Cloudways does for us as a managed host with these advanced features. So I have a server, I have one app installed. I can add more apps here if I want. If I want multiple WordPress websites or instances, I can do that. If I want to have a WordPress instance and another e-commerce website with WooCommerce, for example, I can set up separate apps for that, and they're all going to use that same server, right? Or I can add more servers if I want, right? So hopefully this helps you out a little bit with picking the hosting. I had a great time working with Cloudways so far. I want to thank them for sponsoring this video. If you want to check out Cloudways, make sure you click on the link in the description. Thanks for watching this video, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye.